questions when you ask questions in the instruments themselves, you really want to support diverse lived experience when you write them, as well as in how you ask them. I've seen examples where people spend a painstaking amount of time making sure that they have workshopped and wordsmithed collaboratively the life right out of a question. But then the person who walked into this space to interact with people who are culturally different from themselves completely created a barrier in how they approached using the tool to ask and answer questions. And so it's really, really important that both when we're writing and also when and how we're asking the questions, that we're considering the supporting diverse lived experiences. You also want any question that you ask to provide credible and actionable evidence. And what this means is that we don't want to ask questions out of a space of curiosity. Every question that we ask comes at a cost of someone else's time to answer. And so these need to be really thoughtful questions that are critical for us being able to understand if we are having the impact that we set out to have. There are great opportunities when you start to think through questions and maybe build your questions that you're going to ask people. We start to say things like, it'd be great to know, and I'm curious about. And those can be really fantastic dissertation topics or maybe like one-off assessment projects. But when we're really thinking about something we might dig deeply into with people, we want to make sure that the questions we're asking are meaningful to the people and also meaningful for our organization and continuous improvement and change. And so the other piece of providing that your questions asking credible and actionable evidence is by talking to the population that you're hoping to serve to make sure that these are questions that they can answer and that will help you provide a better service to them. So the example I often use is that if I sent a survey out to people who have never been to the movie theater and I ask them about the quality of their movie theater popcorn, they're not going to be able to give me very credible evidence because they have no idea. They haven't been to the movie theater, they haven't had the popcorn. And so it's really just important to make sure that your questions align with who you're talking to. The next strategy that we want to give you is talking about building. We want you to build relationships and coalitions before, during, and after data collection and sharing. Anytime you have the opportunity to talk about the idea that you're collecting information, that you're asking questions, who you're working with, you have the opportunity to invite people to the table to co-labor with you. And that's a small coalition with a common interest that can do a lot of good. And so we really want you to think about relationships because with data and with equity, neither of those worlds, assessment or equity, should isolate or should operate in isolation, right? They should not be islands floating out there by themselves. They should be embedded in the relationships of an organization and the culture of an organization. And building relationships is a core way to do that. You want to build evidence over time. Not everything that can be measured needs to be measured right now because you probably won't actually have capacity to disaggregate, analyze, report, and act on all of that data at one time. And so be really thoughtful about building evidence over time when you know you'll need it and not all at once. I also want to build bridges across polarized perspectives. And Developing Capacity Coaching has offered some webinars and some handouts and some resources specifically on this topic for reaching across bridges that feel like maybe you're reaching across a canyon and you can't even feel or see that first step. But bringing people together across polarized perspectives and finding some common truth in a data set or in people who are important to serve in your organization can really be a starting point for that coalition building. And I'd also say build hope. And one way to do this is to be able to share the impact that you are having. Maybe every data point won't be a big celebratory win, but if there is progress towards equity, it is worthy of sharing and discussing. Also, if you see clear areas for growth and your action strategies are about addressing those areas, that's also a way to communicate back with people as they've been heard, their experiences matter, and that you're doing what they have asked you to do to better serve them. The last strategies that we'll give you are about center, collaborate, and celebrate. So A, B, and now C. The first one is truly to support and center the diverse lived experiences. This is going right back up to A, where we're talking about how we ask the questions, but there's a difference between how we ask things and how we truly put something at the heart of a process. So if you are thinking through how to go about the assessment journey and the assessment process, at every step of the way, we want to be thinking about how are we honoring the humanity of the people that we're connecting with? How are we centering the idea that, okay, in this study, we're going to be working with some Indigenous populations, and we really want to do our due diligence on learning as much as we can in partnering with people and in centering the fact that there are a lot of cultural nuances that we want to be respected and treated properly in this assessment journey. So that's the difference between asking questions that support a population and really centering the culture of a population in a study or an assessment that you're conducting. When we think about C, we also want to think about collaborating. And assessment tables and equity tables are tables that we can build from scratch, meaning that this is not a zero-sum competition for who gets to have a say in shaping what happens next. You get to build the table and you can invite as many partners and community members as you want to the assessment process and assessment planning table. And so really think about who might find this assessment or this program or this journey really relevant or important to their work. And how can we bring them into the table to either talk about findings, to process findings, to shape our questions, or to explore meaning and make meaning with the data. And the last one is to celebrate when you have equity wins or equity progress. And sometimes this can feel like a really small thing, or we often hear people say, like, it's not a big enough step. And it's really important to acknowledge that equity doesn't happen because we wake up in the morning and decide individually to move Mount Everest. Equity happens because we all come to a table together and decide to move our part of the mountain in the best way that we can. And we keep moving it for as long as it takes to achieve equitable outcomes for the humans that we're trying to serve. So that's kind of our ABCs for assessment and equity. This is a way to think about the assessment process and how you can embed equity throughout the journey of the process, but also with the outcome of the process, which is, hey, you've got all this amazing data now at your disposal that you can use to make all kinds of decisions. With this, we're going to go on to our panel discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides and I'll go back to sharing them in just a second. But I really want you to be able to forefront our panelists. Can everybody, are we all looking at one another here? Great. Okay, just making sure. Okay, so our first question as a panel, and I'd love to start with Divya, is what is the relationship between data and equity, and how does this relationship show up in your environment?
So first of all, what a great presentation, because I'm going to keep alluding to all the strategies that you that you just discussed. So thank you. And thank you for the question. So a lot of times when we think about data, for some reason, people's mind immediately goes to quantitative data, like it's numbers, and I'm not good with numbers, or I don't know numbers, or, that's like, I'm not like, that's not my thing. And so the first thing that I want to share with people is a lot of that data is not objective, right? And data is not just numbers. Data is about the story that can be told or the information that can be gleaned, right? And so when we think about data and equity, a lot of times when people use data to build equity or advance equity, they're only thinking about, oh, I need to disaggregate whatever information I have by race, ethnicity, international status, first generation status, socioeconomic status, whatever it is, right? And so, yes, so that's one way of using data, where you use the data and then you disaggregate it and see like how are, this group versus this group performing, etc. But a lot of times people don't focus on the front end of the data collection, which is where you said the ask and the build, right? And the centering, so to speak. And that has to do with however we get that first data, those data points, whether it's like course grades or whether it's number of participants or whether it is performance, they got like a 5 on a 4 on a 5 in a rubric scale. However, we collected that. That is dependent on the kinds of questions that we ask and who was part of that conversation of crafting those questions and what questions didn't get asked and how did those questions get asked. So the importance of making sure that all the right people are at the table to discuss what's on the table is really, really important. So data is significantly subjective. Numbers are not objective. How those numbers came to be and what those numbers say are based on questions that were asked or models that were used in thinking about something in a particular way. So it's really important to embed equity in the whole data collection process, in the action planning process, as much as after the fact, after you get the data. So pay attention to the front end as much as to the back end. So I'll leave it there.
I'd love to add something that Divya hinted towards, but not only about what the process looks like, but who's involved in that process and who gets to ask the questions. There's a lot of times where we think the equity work at an institution has to be whoever the assessment professional is or whoever the equity professional is at the institution, but there's also students who might have some really good questions that could help us better understand, and there's some adjuncts that have some really good questions, even though often we just see them as a person who's gathering the data for somebody else's question. And so being really inclusive about who gets to ask those questions.
And I'll just jump in on that, like, absolutely. And I think the thing that sometimes we forget when we get caught up in like the data and the questions is that these things are representing people's experiences. There are actual humans behind the questions, behind the numbers. And I think it's important as we're trying to shape these stories that we tell through data that we think about like pausing and considering the identities in the room, the privileges, the lived experiences, and how those approach the work. And I know a lot of times, specifically in the quantitative work, a lot of people think, oh, you could be 100% objective. Unfortunately, that's not the truth. Nothing is 100% objective. There's always subjectivity. And so I always like to have a couple of like checklists in mind as I'm going through this and making sure I'm asking myself, does this data accurately represent the people's identity, experiences, and voices that is intended to do that? Because I think sometimes we get so caught up in the sophistication of the data analytics or the coding or in the quantitative that we forget about the people and the humans. And so I always ask myself, why does this matter for the people behind this? And how can I be a facilitator of dignifying their experiences?
Well, how can I be a facilitator of dignifying their experiences? Whew, Renee. And so this is what we're talking about when we say things like centering, right? It's putting that truly at the heart through which, and in DCC, we have a practice called the equity purposed practice. And we talk about like, how do we make equity the center, like the heart through which everything else flows? And so Renee, that's what I hear you saying, like every time I'm engaged in this process, I have this core kind of thing that I'm centering, these questions that I'm asking myself. But I think also going back to what Divya said, like when we're talking about centering humanity, we also mean our own, because our identities and our experiences come with us to the work. And I agree, there is a lot of, just for clarification for anybody who may not readily know this, quantitative usually means we're talking about numbers, and qualitative usually means we're talking about stories or narrative. And so when we talk a lot about quantitative data, it used to be kind of an inherent truth that it was objective and so deeply decontextualized that it was also not influenced by identities. But Renee and I have some classical training over in the measurement world and testing development, like large scale standardized and international tests. And we can tell you that like on the back end and on the front end, you can see where instruments can be biased. And that's because the people who write them are biased or may not be centering the multifaceted nature or audience in which this test is going to go in front of. And so these are just great, fantastic examples of some of the strategies that we're talking about coming to life. I'll also say, and we're talking about, does the question matter to the people who we're working with or working for? Stepping outside the higher ed context, which is where a lot of us have experience, Dr. Anise Fisher and I were working with a series of professionals through in the justice system in Illinois. And we put the data person with like a program manager and a couple of other people around the table from a county. And we could really just watch all of these ideas click together about like, oh my gosh, these people have never been at the table together. And now we have so many more questions. But the first question we have is, why do our program outcomes look like this? And why is one group of people having one kind of outcome and another group of people is having a very different outcome? What can we be doing differently? Like taking that ownership of the data, and because it's about the program that you're leading. All right. Our second question is, what strategies have you used to successfully help people explore or use the data as it relates to equity? And so I'm going to start this with Renee.
This is a great question. And I think this is something that comes to light. And I think back on my past 16 years of experience doing student affairs assessment. And this is one aspect that no one prepared me for. And so a lot of the learning has been like more like trial by fire, making a lot of mistakes along the way. But I think thinking about these data detractors and thinking about them as humans, right? Because when we think about equity work, we have to remember they're also humans. They come from a very unique lived experience, and we have to recognize that as humanity. And so one of the things that I first do, because those are the questions I mentioned earlier, recognizing the humanity in this, is thinking about having an empathetic approach. Because I think initially, as someone, some of you may know my background, I was a first generation scholar, first in my family to go to college. I was told I wouldn't be successful in higher education, that I should just, quit and just be a full-time mother. And obviously I ignored all that and got my PhD. But going through this process, I was very upset the first time that I encountered this. So fast forward 16 years later, I've learned a little bit of different methods. And some of those strategies are to have humanity as we approach these people, and have a little bit of empathy, because they are coming from a different lived experience. And 99% of the time, I really feel like these folks that are really pulling back have a different narrative that doesn't match the data that you're sharing. And so I use this as a learning opportunity to pause and use it as a mechanism to work with them together to build some of those competencies and help be uncomfortable in the uncomfortableness. Because some of these conversations, specifically on our campus, we're dealing a lot with basic needs right now. And anytime I present a narrative about our students struggling, because it doesn't make our campus look good, I get our senior leaders pulling back, attacking the methodology, finding every reason to discredit the entire data and stories that we have, both quantitative and qualitative. And so I've used it as an opportunity to sit in the uncomfortableness, to talk about, okay, what's making you uncomfortable with this information? Let's talk about that. Let's hear these other narratives. Let's hear your narrative, and let's come to a compromise here. And again, as CG said, celebrate the small wins. I consider this a small win. Just even getting folks in the same room who are not happy about something, bringing them to the table, respecting them, centering them in the process, and helping them work through this together. I think that's part of my MO, and that's one of the big strategies that I've really taken on. Is I'm not afraid of that, because I don't see it as conflict per se. I see it as more of a, let's come together as humans and let's figure out the best approach collectively that we can do. And I respect their unique experience. And if they've never had to experience food insecurity or housing insecurity, that's awesome privilege to have. Now let's talk about the students who may not have that, and let's figure out how we can support them as a community. So really just building that culture of like bringing them together, collaborating, centering them, respecting their humanity, but then also working together to like dispel myths about things, unpack those unhealthy assumptions, and work more collectively to have more of a positive and inclusive environment. Those are some of the strategies that come to mind when I think about this first question.
Mm-hmm. Glenn or Divya, would you have anything to add?
Glenn, go for it. I'll
Yeah.
follow up.
I would say that one of the strategies that I think is really helpful is to ask the question, as Renee rightfully pointed out, when you provide information, especially to leadership, showcasing a weakness at the institution that may make some populations more vulnerable, their immediate response, because part of their job is to protect their institution, is to attack the methodology, to attack the information that's been given. And I think a really valuable strategy is to ask the question, if we believe this to be true, what then would we do? How then would we collectively change our process, our programs, or our approach to these students if we believe this to be true, to make sure that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that we can do something, and to help them understand we can do something, and then to dig in more to the data to understand what is the data saying, and if there are methodological issues, because we are not all perfect, and we all come with our own biases, and sometimes we want the data to say certain things. We see this a lot in folks who, part of my field is working specifically with student veterans, and a lot of folks want more attention on student veterans, recognition of student veterans, recognitions of the challenges of student veterans, and they will purposefully create a deficit narrative around student veterans to try to get more resources, when in reality, many of the narratives around student veterans are actually success narratives, especially in comparison to their peers. And so thinking about, where are we getting this data? Why is this data important? But then if we did believe this, what's our next step? What would we do? What would we choose to do? And trying to get them excited about what that would look like. I think that's a really valuable strategy for helping people explore that.
I loved what you said, Glenn, about so if you believe that, if this was true, to start there, because I think it goes back to this idea that, institutions, if we think about, CG shared, the mission of this organization and, what we're doing. So when we go back to the mission of any educational institution or any program, you go back to the mission or the vision, then you can draw that link saying, we are here to do this. This is what we value. This is why we are here. So if we are trying to make sure that all students are successful, or we're trying to make sure that all students are ready to learn or ready for the workforce, or, are critical thinkers, or whatever it is. So coming back to what the purpose is and drawing that attention, rather than saying, do we want to just have a good publicity message or a publicity statement about we are number 5th in, in the ranking, or however those rankings are done, and we won't even get it. That's like a whole nother conversation. But to go back into, we are here to serve our students. So this is what the data is saying that our students are, need. So that's one thing. Are we here to respond, to be responsive? And if we are, and if we are trying to live our mission and our values, how do we do that? Can we use this data to do that? So that's one strategy where you help people center, the focus again, so that while people think different things, it's like, we all came here, we all believe in this mission, we all, we are all working towards it. So that's one. The other thing, the other strategy, what I've often found is sometimes we're not looking at the right data. We are using the data that has been prescribed by leaders or by what we have been told is the data that we're supposed to look at, maybe by accreditors or by compliance of, by compliance efforts, that we forget, like, what's the data that we need to actually focus on. So an example of this is, I was serving a particular institution, I think the Ombuds office, and many times these offices are one person office. And so a lot of times for compliance purposes, all that you need to track is how many students did you serve? And it could be a disability office. It could be a, like any office, right? So a lot of times you're like, okay, I served this many students. We did these activities. We did this kind of programming. This is how we serve them. And so instead, the suggestion that I had was, imagine if you track the kind of cases that came in around, student conduct issues, right? And which policies in the student conduct code or which policies in the faculty or student handbook you had to, that they were bringing in each of those issues. So you are not focusing on just the number of students coming in, you're focusing on the issues that they're bringing in. And then you'll find that, oh my God, it's this particular language or this particular policy that's coming up on a recurring basis. So can we take that particular policy back to the faculty senate and tell the faculty senate, hey, this policy has a lot of room for interpretation and it's unclear and it's coming up as an issue again and again and again. Can you revisit this policy and address the policy? So a lot of times we are not looking at the right data because we've been told, like, hey, if you are a tutoring center, look at did students' grades improve? And it's like, no, my tutoring center does not have a direct correlation with student grades improving because it's a 1-year process for them to keep coming and for their grades to improve and for all these strategies to be in place. So what I can do is actually assess, are students working on that particular assignment, and are they understanding the concept better, and can their instructor vouch that they've understood that concept? So make sure that we look at the right data and get the right data in front of the right people. A lot of times we don't have access to the folks in power to be able to tell the story with the data that we have. So find ways and make alliances and build relationships to get that data in front of the right people who can make change happen. So those are the strategies.
I really love the idea of looking at policies and also looking at those policies and how they affect certain kinds of students disproportionately, to be able to reflect on that. One of the things that when I was at Howard, I was in a small office, and it was me as the director of assessment and then the director of IR. And it was my first time being in an office where they were that close. And she taught me how to do a pivot table. And I thought I was a magician, you know, the normal things that assessment folks do. But one of the things that we spoke about, and then it came up again in my capacity at Watermark, is that both IR folks and engineers don't want you to fix everything. They want you to come with the problem. And so often we have assessment folks who will go to their IR and say, I need this data. And they will provide it because that's what IR folks do. But what if instead you went to them and said, I have this problem. I have this question, right? I would go to my folks at product and say, we need to add this button. And 9 times out of the 10, there is a far more elegant way to fix whatever issue I had, because I'm not a product engineer. And I think we go to IR saying this is the data that we need. They know their data far better than we do. And if we just ask the question, who knows what kind of cool stuff that we could get? And so I think part of it is, as Divya said, making friends and partnering, but also respecting the tools that other people come with that you might not have.
Now,
Yeah. And oh, go ahead, Renee.
Oh, sorry. I'll just add to that. I think part of that, like centering the humans and making it approachable and meaningful, is that we also got to like make it fun. And I think part of doing that is have a lot of visuals. And one thing I have learned also through my time is not to assume that people with these letters after their names have these advanced understanding of what we're talking about. And so I try to avoid jargon like technical terms and make it as approachable as possible and have visuals. People love visuals. I like to create almost a lot of like mind maps and frameworks just to kind of help people through the process, as well as I'm sharing data. And something actually, this is thanks to you, CG. You gave me this idea years ago, but we started Metric Mondays almost 4 years ago, and we send a like pretty little infographic every Monday through our listserv, a link to our report. And the whole point is we're making it less jargony, less technical, approachable, meaningful, fun. And we're also like inspiring people. We're not coming up with the solutions. We're saying like, here, this is what we learned. These are like, this is our lens, but we empower you to think about this, spark curiosity, reach out to us. And it's been a really great method on like making it fun and approachable using visuals and design thinking.
I think too, just drawing it again out of the higher ed context, or like kind of adjacent context, this idea of bringing data to a level that people can really truly understand it is one kind of situation where you have to help people get unstuck. But then helping people be able to embrace it to the point of being able to see how might this information inform action is another kind of level of unstuck. And I remember one time Renee and I were having a conversation because we had done this really big project, and we have done like some data collection and analysis with mayors and also like government intervention or judicial intervention programs. And so we often see that when we're giving people data, it's sometimes the first time they're really seeing it in that way, or we've simplified it. And so they're just looking at one piece of information. And I find a couple of things. I find one, that it's harder to attack the methodology when you're only kind of looking at one piece of the puzzle. You're not looking at like the kind of classic 25-page printout of a massive report and 150 data points. You're just looking at a handful of things that are aligned with what we say are our outcomes and priorities. So I would throw that in there. I often use language when people try to say, like, you're the evaluation person, or like, weren't you supposed to do that for us when we're in like a contractual like client relationship, right? And Anise and I have this phrase where when we're talking with somebody, we help them really truly understand that while we may be like the content experts in assessment, evaluation, leveraging data to advance equity, they are the context experts. And unless we have them at the table as a true partner and collaborative agent, we are not going to be able to give them the best quality of information that makes sense and is actionable and credible in their context. And so we lean on that kind of language a lot, and it does tend to open up, build those bridges across different perspectives or people who might be really resistant to getting the information. Another way that I think we've helped people, or I've seen in my time, help someone get a little unstuck, especially when the data point doesn't align with their lived experience, as Renee brought up earlier, is I often will just ask the question, like, why do you think that might be?
Yeah.
And we were having a conversation one time. It was me and a couple of other partners and a handful of older men, white men in their late 60s. And we were talking about how best to create a set of information to welcome young people into an organization. And they were saying, well, like, here's what they need to know. We need to tell them this and yada, 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 right? Like they were just like going in on like the checklist. And we talked about the data that we had present, went back to the why for what we were doing. And one of the partners who kind of fit that demographic of like older white man in his 60s was like, well, here's what I know they need to have. And here's what I used when I was, coming into a new organization to kind of figure my way around. And he said, and so I asked that question, why do you think that might be different than what our youth might need from us right now? And I wasn't really sure what his answer would be, but I thought I'd pose the question. And he said, well, I guess I don't have a lot of things in common with racially diverse youth. And I was like, yes, and you do have a lot of knowledge and expertise for years and years and years of working in this sector. So how do we meet in the middle here? And so I was honoring of his humanity, but I also just found it to be it could have been a kind of like provocative moment. And instead it was this like, well, I guess there's more we probably need to think about here. That's not just what I'm saying. And I just really appreciated that gentle kind of question can bring that out for someone.
For me, as I'm just listening to you and Renee and Glenn talking about it, I think it's the importance of communication, right? Ultimately, it's the importance of getting the message across, however it may be, consistently to people. And sometimes that can be where you don't come up with the findings, where you just share the information and say, how are you making sense of this data? Can you share? And then it's such a, for all the folks who say, I'm not a data person, it's such an aha moment, because then they get to try to figure out, like, what does this data mean? What question are we missing? What is this information? So that's really, so I think, communication is a big deal. And the other thing that came to mind that I don't think we've touched on yet with respect to this question is the small N's. So methodology people attack, but the other thing they also attack is, oh, it's just like those 5 students. So I know it's not really like a university-wide issue, or I don't think it's like a county-wide issue or whatever. It's a small N, and we know who that population is, and they are just like that. Or, so there's like a deficit kind of dismissing attitude to when people talk about those small N's. And I think it's really important then to use key strategies. And some of the strategies that I use is actually I educate them about deficit thinking and deficit language, and how, this conversation right now is reflective of that. Or another strategy that I use is where I say, just like rape cases, just like sexual harassment cases, where if you have one, you have 9 others that are going unreported. This issue is as systemic as that, right? Is as endemic as that. And so we need to, while we have one person reporting that there's a racism issue on campus, or there is a whatever issue on campus, we can count that as X number, because people will talk about it, but sometimes people don't feel safe reporting about it. And so then, so there are multiple strategies, but that small N, if that's an issue that you're dealing with, come with a few canned responses practice that with a friend or a colleague in terms of when people say, oh, but that's a small number, or it's just those athletes or those whoever, or those students are commuter students and they're just not engaged or whatever it is. Come up with a response, practice that response in advance so that then you can communicate and go deeper than, you know, where the conversation gets cut off at the small end, then you don't know what to do. You can't take action.
So I want to acknowledge that we're at time, and I know we started pretty close to on time, so we'll wrap up here, but start posting any questions that you might have in the chat, and we will stay and answer them, as many as we can get to. But if you're curious about this intersection of equity and leadership, Dr. Fisher has taken a lot of the work and the strategies and the ideas that we have covered in the last 10 webinars that we have done in 2023, and even prior to that, and shape them into an online course that really facilitates deep learning at your own pace. And we call it our Conscious People for Equity course. And you can actually receive a LinkedIn badge and certification if you choose to enroll in the course and complete it. So something for you to consider if you really like this idea of trying to learn more about that intersection of leadership and equity. We always end with this quote from somebody that we admire and respect deeply, Miss Bell Hooks. And so true resistance to inequity begins with people confronting pain, whether it's yours or someone else's, and wanting to do something to change it. That's why we talk so much about that idea of centering humanity and building bridges and acknowledging that people are coming to the data and coming to data collection and coming to any experience from their own walk of life, which may look substantially different from how we came to be in that same experience. Thank you so much for coming today. Again, please feel free to drop any questions you might have in the chat. We cannot wait to answer them. If you need to head out, we understand. And again, thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists and for all of our attendees who showed up today. Can you share strategies for identifying and collecting data you don't have yet, but you need? Any thoughts?
The first thing I'll say really quickly is that you might have it, you just don't know that you have it, or someone else has it. The second thing that I would always ask is, why do you want it? And just ask yourself why you want it, because sometimes assessment folks and data folks are dangerous people because we just want all the things. We just want them all so then we can make a decision. But if it takes significant effort to get that data, we need to have some reason or some purpose in capturing that data and to really partner with someone to get that data. So those would be my immediate response.
Yeah, the why is so important. I agree with Renee and with Glenn. I would also say, like, are there partners who might have that information? I would also start to ask questions like, is there a reason this information hasn't been collected? Like, is there some type of protection in place where maybe it's important that because of our entity or organization, like if you're a housing entity, maybe there's some legality around what information you can and can't collect due to discrimination. And so thinking about why you need it, if it hasn't been collected yet, why that might be, if there are partners who might have some sense of that data, if there's an existing national data set that you could begin to use to answer some of your questions. Anything else that can start to kind of, those are some strategies that I would use for starting to think about data you need but haven't collected yet.
I also, oh, go ahead, Renee.
I was going to say, I'll jump in and say this is where your network and the relationships come in handy, is reaching out to these folks and having those discussions, especially with people with longer organizational history and knowledge than you, because I think CG kind of hit the nail on the head, is there's reasons why some data hasn't been collected, and that could be a whole other separate conversation. So lean on your network and the relationships that you've built, because that's going to be actually pivotal as you think about collecting this data.
Yeah. And the one additional small little thing is when you're collecting fresh data, or if you're getting access to new data, think about who it's going to impact, right? And many times decisions like that data is maybe not used for what it was originally intended. So think about who all that data can impact and make sure that they are involved in the conversation as well when you think about collecting that data. So.
I'm seeing Dr. Roberts' question of looking for words of encouragement working in a state that doesn't support DEI work. So even having data about different populations is not something we can use to develop specific interventions. I know I have a lot of thoughts here. Does anybody else want to start with responding to that? Or you want me to just go ahead? Okay, so something that I have found in working with a couple of states who are heading in that same direction, Darby, as Texas, is talking about things in a way that still allows you to make moves for equity, but talking about them a little more broadly. And so one of the things that I was helping some community college presidents with is reshaping things away from like inclusive pronouns like they, them, and getting tripped up on grammar and like all the little excuses they had for not wanting to build inclusive pronouns, right? One of the things we're talking about is how might you create an affirming environment for anybody who is a part of your community? And so we switched, right? We switched this idea of like equity being the center of the word equity being the center of everything, but still keeping at the heart of our actions, but talking about each intervention as an opportunity to create spaces of affirmation and belonging for those we're trying to serve. Some additional things that we've talked about that have been really helpful for people is this idea that equity is a continuum, right? So there's like upholding status quo at one end and like completely dismantling systems and rebuilding them with the people that they need to serve at the other end. And there's a lot of room to move along that continuum of progress towards equitable outcomes. And so having that language of continuum and being able to see examples from other states who were in similar situations or other institutions who were in similar situations, people found to be really, really helpful because they were getting stuck in like the wordsmithing and they, them pronouns rather than how do we think a little differently about this, step back, think a little differently about this and think about like, okay, so in the one state I was working in, undocumented students were not eligible for financial aid. So could we then instead fundraise, right, to curate a list of funds for students? Could we shift some of our policies to extend deadlines so that students don't get this status and then have an immediate financial implication, right? So we really start to step back away from language and nuance and towards bigger picture reconceptualizing how could we create opportunities to affirm and create access and create successful completion. Access to and benefit from is how Dr. Fisher describes equity. Equal access to and benefit from services and programs. So we found that kind of stepping back and reframing to be really, really helpful when the political context can be incredibly rife.
One of the things again, and yeah, I don't know where to start with this issue. So a couple of things. So one is a UDL framework, like when you use a UDL approach, that language, universal design thinking, I think that is a strategic way in which you can talk about diversity and differences and different needs and making sure that things are equitable, because that the framework itself lends itself to making sure that everyone has access, everyone is able to thrive. So that's one framework that you can use. I think another one, another resource, at least for me, has been a lot of the work. It's just community building. So it's asking. So what CG had already just mentioned, right? Building those relationships with people saying, what are you doing? And having those confidential conversations saying, how are you overcoming this? What are you doing? NADOHE is also NADOHE, NADOHE, which is like the National Diversity Officers in Higher Education like network. They have a lot of good resources for folks in terms of how to deal with this, because whole offices have been dismantled. And so reaching out to folks who can support you to do the work and to support students, I think is really important. And just a big virtual hug to everyone dealing with this situation. You were looking for words of encouragement, and I wish I could also just give you a hug. So
I would really briefly offer, I mentioned this earlier in the chat, but there are some institutional leaders that I've spoken with who have really refocused it on trying to align equity issues with what they know legislature or institutional leadership does want. And so it's like, yeah, we're aiming for this. So for example, if you start by saying, we need to identify ways to support first generation students, I'll just use that as an example, in math courses because they're not being successful, right? Then we're refocusing on this kind of, well, is this equity? What's going on here? But if instead we said our goal is that everyone is successful in mathematics, let's first ask the question, is there anyone who traditionally and disproportionately is not succeeding in these courses? And then when that data tells them, yeah, very strangely, students with a low EFC are not successful in these courses, then we're just fixing a student population that was identified in the data. We didn't come to it with this travel case of these are the equity terms I want to use. This is our agenda. And so aligning your agenda with their agenda. And again, sadly, some of this has to be covert equity work in some of these spaces, but it doesn't mean that it's not still meaningful equity work.
And so
I
I
think
also, oh, go ahead, Renee.
just jumping in really quick, if you could find community with other folks dealing with this. I know with Sal, we've hosted some conversations with some organizations, and even just commiserating with each other humans in the same space has helped. So just encouraging you all to find your community if you're interested in that. Sal's working right now with the big student affairs entities, ACPA and NASPA, to get them to come to a meeting with some of these folks to give them some words of encouragement. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to me.
So the last thing I'll share is that this is a webinar about assessment and equity. And so Dr. Fisher shared a link in the chat that is about just really genuinely giving us feedback, sharing things like just like one takeaway if you want to learn more about developing capacity coaching. And so please take a moment. Dr. Fisher, if you'll drop that link in the chat again, that would be really helpful. Panelists, I'm happy to share responses with you. But thank you again so much today. We really, really, really appreciate your time and your energy to our attendees, but also so much so to the hearts and souls and minds of our panelists who came today and helped to support learning and engagement. I appreciate each and every one of you as individuals and professionals. Thank you so much. Please take our assessment. Dr. Fisher will drop it in the chat. Yeah, the equity course that we offer is called Conscious People for Equity. And if you go to the Developing Capacity website, which I'll drop in the chat, you can see the course and you can actually access it directly. So I can get you that link. Any other questions or anything that you all need from us before you go about the remainder of the holiday season? Or you need from us around data and equity, assessment equity? All right, thank you so much. Take the assessment. We can't wait to hear your feedback, and I'm grabbing that link right now, Sarah.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Oh, I can't. Hey, Dr. Fisher, could you drop the link to the Be Free